Hello and welcome to episode 28 of the Money Side Up podcast, the personal finance podcast covering all things finance related for Australians living in Australia and all over the world. I'm Jarrad Brown. Joining me today, my friends and colleagues, Joel Kerin and William Cant of Ally Wealth Management. Joel in Hong Kong, Will in New South Wales. G'day guys, how are we going?
Yeah, thanks for always good to be here. Episode number 28. Feels like we've done 500 of these already. We've only done 28, so I'm sure we'll be at number 500 before we know it.
Definitely, for sure.
Absolutely. And now look, usually we have a guest speaker on these podcast episodes, as our frequent listeners will know. But today it's just the three of us. We are going to dive into the budget, some of the key changes, what people are thinking about, conversations we're having, some of the key topics. But before we do, obviously need to keep our legal team happy. Joel, do you want to run us through our disclaimer?
Absolutely. So everything that we do discuss here, and it is a very topical piece of conversation that we're going to be going through. So just sort of take this at the moment as a bit general in nature throughout this podcast and through any of our other podcast episodes. If you do want to know how these changes impact you directly, please feel free to reach out to one of us personally, and we can provide you with personal financial advice and take you through, I suppose, the more intricacies of your personal situation, rather than this just being, in general. So please reach out to us.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joel. Now, what we're going to do today is kind of dive or step through rather each of the proposed changes. Before we do, probably just worth noting at the time of recording, so it's currently the 11th of June as we're recording, just for a bit of context. So we have seen the proposed changes go through the lower house and to be debated in the Senate next week. So nothing is legislation. Everything we are talking about, everything that was proposed in the budget is just at proposal stage. So please don't assume that anything is already in force or something you've read online is in effect and go and make some crazy changes. To Joel's point, seek advice, consider what's right for you. So on that note, let's just start, I guess, at a very high level. This is probably one of the most widely anticipated, widely watched, widely read, widely digested budgets I can recall personally, to be honest, with the conversations we're having. But yeah, guys, I guess just walk me through some of the high level conversations you're having. What are people saying? What are people thinking? What was expected before? What's going on the ground?
Well, first and foremost, I'd add to that list widely criticised budgets. And there was definitely not a lot of fans to this budget. Some of us on the call, I believe, included. I think you hit the nail on the head, the fact that this is all proposed at the moment. Nothing is legislated. I just want to touch on a really good example of how, the media really sensationalizing this budget as well. And like you said, it's been so, blasted in front of our faces for the last few weeks that so many people are really becoming really worried about it, or how's it going to impact their situation? What's going to happen? A good example is the superannuation changes that came into effect a while ago, right? What was announced and what became legislated were both very, very different. So really, really important as we talk through this today to note that what actually becomes law might be very, very different to what they've proposed. But conversations we're having on the ground, I mean, to be honest, people are worried. People are worried about their money. People are worried about the impact they're going to have. They're worried about the taxes. I think a lot of it comes from a misunderstanding of how these rules actually come into play, how they come into effect, and how they'll impact people's situations. But I think the media does a great job of, really emphasizing the negative. And when people see this and they think, oh, I have a property, does that mean that, now I have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars more tax, because I heard this scenario and that's how it's going to work. So without fully understanding the impacts, a lot of people are very worried and very scared, with this budget and what it might mean for their financial future. But I think once you really start to talk through the implications, the 50% CGT discount, disappearing being a big one, when you really talk through how it works, what the change would be, when it starts, how the indexation method applies, people start to understand it a lot more. And don't get me wrong, for the majority of people, it would be more tax, but I think it's, not something that people need to be completely terrified of as such. It's more understanding your situation, understanding your options. And I'd say for 95% of people I've been talking to, no change in their strategy direction is needed based on this, based on what they're doing, based on their circumstances, based on the pathway that we were taking. It's a small handful of people that and we'll get through it a little bit more today, but people with trusts and bucket companies and those types of structures, okay, well, now their strategy may need to change depending on these new tax rules and what becomes more beneficial. But I think that's the headline that I would say is, don't rush off and make any drastic decisions of this. For the majority of people, yes, there are some changes coming. Yes, it might mean we pay a little bit more tax, but it doesn't mean that we're changing the direction, because you're still heading down that pathway you want to head down. It's just the rules are changing of the game.
Do you know, I was also thinking about this, sometimes in a lot of situations, you see, for example, the pendulum, swing very heavily one way, which obviously promotes a lot of conversation. It promotes a lot of debate about sort of the retrospective impacts of, specific changes. And, to an extent, this is one of the probably most significant tax reforms. So, if the government deserves any credit, snaps for them to come out and actually have a go and really sort of swing the hammer and say, right, we'll go really, really extreme in one direction. Maybe, and that will obviously spark, debate within Parliament, within the Australian people, to say, right, well, what is the actual optimal setup? Because what that has recommended is not the case. What we have right now is possibly not the case. So where is that middle ground? So I think, to an extent, yes, this hopefully for a lot of people, this becomes a sort of short-term pain scenario rather than an enduring, impact to Australians more broadly. So I suppose time will tell. Australians will go to the next election and vote with their sort of knowledge and their hands and hearts. So yeah, I suppose time will tell, but maybe this will be the stick that finally says, right, well, what is right for Australia?
Yeah, a very good point. Well, look, let's dive into, I guess, some of the details. So at a headline level, in terms of how this was positioned, how it was promoted, it was very much, to use the terms already raised, swinging the pendulum in the favour of workers, away from investors, to sort of reduce some tax-led investment decision-making, and to obviously significantly increase the tax take, so the tax revenue the government receives from the structures used by the wealthy. Now, that is a little farcical. We'll dive into some of that today, because structures like companies and trusts are not solely used by the wealthy. Often, every business owner in Australia, which is a huge portion of the population, will have a trust or asset protection. But more on that to come. So let's start at the very beginning. The capital gains tax discount. Now, we have already seen draft legislation introduced. It passed through the lower house at a rate of knots. No surprise, current leadership controls the lower house, and it will go to the Senate next week. But I guess let's start with, what is the current setup on capital gains tax? How does it currently work, and what is it going to change to?
Yeah, so I'll run through that one for everyone. So effectively at the moment, we have the 50% CGT discount, which is effectively when you own an asset for more than a year, half of your gain is eliminated in terms of tax purposes. So let's say you bought an investment property for $1 million and you sold it 10 years later for $2 million. You've made $1 million gain on that asset. Under the current rules, only $500,000 of that gain would be assessable for tax purposes. So if you're on the top marginal tax rate, it's about a 250 odd grand tax bill. The new methodology, what they're bringing in from July 1st, 2027, is an indexation method that is linked to inflation. So again, let's say you owned it for the same 10 years, very rough numbers. Let's say inflation was 3% a year. You owned it for 10 years, you get a 30% uplift in your cost base. So your $1 million becomes 1.3. Therefore, you now have $700,000 of assessable gain. Again, on that same marginal tax rate, it's about $350K in taxes. So you can see the big change there. Now, with this new methodology, though, the time that you own assets becomes very, very important. With the current methodology, the 50% CGT discount, you just needed to own something for more than a year. So if you'd made, $100,000 gain on your asset in 13 months, and I've made $100,000 gain on my asset in 4 years, we would effectively pay the same tax if we're on the same marginal tax rate. Now with this indexation method, we would pay very different rates of tax. because you would only have 1 year of indexation apply, whereas I would have 4 years of indexation apply. So the longer you own assets, the more it increases that cost base. In other words, if you're making profit faster, you pay more tax on that as well. So again, this can be a massive, massive concern for people who, it's common when you see people flipping properties is a good example. Now, a lot of people do that in a company structure, and obviously these things don't impact that type of structure. But people who renovate homes and sell them, or those types of things, where they're doing so within a 12-month period or an 18-month period, potentially the majority of that gain becomes accessible at your marginal tax rate, which can be a massive, massive tax bill compared to half of it disappearing in the old methodology. So big, big changes for, some people out there.
And I think as well, Will, what the sort of key missing point of that with the indexation method as well was the, 30% minimum tax. So
True.
when we factor in, those inflation adjusted gains, you could have no other income that year on, let's just say if you were back in that same sort of scenario, if you made 100 grand on a share or a property or something, after the 50% reduction, you're paying tax on $50,000, right? That's not going to be that much tax. It's going to be probably at best a couple of maybe 5 or 10 grand or something like that after tax offsets. But now with that 30% minimum tax, that really changes the positioning. And I think the government's taken this with the view that it will sort of cool the housing. Housing has obviously been the biggest driver of issues, particularly in the political force in Australia. So if you're saying now that in these inflation adjusted sort of returns are going to yield less tax outcomes, is that going to obviously produce more housing supply? I suppose time will tell, but or are investors just going to continue to hold their assets into, for as long as possible into perpetuity? Is that changing over the housing market?
But I think that's what really ticked a lot of people off, right? Is the fact that their reasoning for this was to create more housing supply and have more homes available. But then they're doing this on things like shares. And, if the three of us were to start a business today and we were to, sell pens or something like that, we incorporate our business for, $1 a share. We work our butts off. We work 16-hour days for a couple of years. Our business, does really, really well. We decide to divest out of it in 10 years' time. We have a massive tax bill, on that business sale. So what on earth does that have to do with helping the property market in Australia? You're just killing innovation, in the country. And I think it's my opinion, before this comes legislated, that's something to do with the share component of this discount, or the small business exemptions of this discount will come into effect, and it won't be as it's currently been proposed, because I just see way too much uproar. And you'll just see people not incentivized to, take a risk and start a business, which is, as you said rightly at the start, Jarrad, the amount of Australians that run their own business, start their own business, like it's a huge, huge percentage of the population.
It really is, yeah. And I mean, I think, we've probably seen, like, if you're on Facebook, it's probably all over Instagram, we've all seen the posts with Albo being, the new 47% shareholder in everyone's business. And hats off to, to the guys who sort of kicked off that campaign. I think it's been wonderful. But I guess just to, to sort of flesh that out for a lot of people, to your point, where we start up that business selling pens. Yeah, great idea. Probably a little saturated, but see how we go. But, the truth of the matter is we don't really put in any capital. So it's effectively what we would call sweat equity. So it's not like we invested 100,000 and it grew at 6 or 7% a year, and the indexation method is not that bad. We might have put in nothing, and the equity we've created has been from 100% hard work, effort, maybe a bit of luck in there as well. And now we still owe that 47%. So it really raises, a lot of important considerations. A, how you structure the ownership of that entity. But of course, if it's worth nothing today, it's also a bit of forward planning around what that could be worth later on. So I think that entrepreneurial wealth and that sort of high risk investment, to your point, well, I'd love to see some carve outs here for small businesses. I think that would be a big win for a lot of the country. But if not, I think that's really where it hits hard. And it's not just business owners. If you're investing in crypto or private equity or, venture capital, high risk investments where you're targeting 25, 50, 100% returns. Now, if we get to pay tax on 97% of that instead of half of it, that's a big whopping difference. So I think that really changes the appeal for a lot of those investors.
Yeah, look, I think there's still a lot of Australians too that will start businesses and will stay here and will continue to, have their base here. But I will argue it is getting more and more popular. I'm having many more conversations now than I did 5 years ago or 10 years ago about people asking the questions. What would it look like if I moved to Singapore to start the business, or Dubai? It's definitely becoming a much more popular thing to consider starting the business overseas and not in Australia. And what would that mean? And obviously there's a whole other, a can of worms that you need to look at when you go down that pathway. But it's becoming a question that people are asking a lot more than what they would used to of.
Look, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. As someone currently sitting in Asia in low tax jurisdictions.
I believe I'm the only one in Australia on the call right now, so maybe it's my turn to come overseas as well.
But it's also been fun watching New Zealand's response to this. I don't know if you guys have followed along, but basically the Treasurer and the Prime Minister of New Zealand has basically said, well, New Zealand has no capital gains tax. We have a very basic tax system. Are we then going to be seeing, those small businesses they pop up now in New Zealand, and, that sort of happens as a sort of reverse migration, let's call it. Australia's normally been the sort of safe big brother for Kiwis that want to, I suppose, make some money and make something for themselves. And now are we going to actually see the reverse? Well, who knows?
Yeah, a very interesting one. I'm sure we'll see a bit of movement. And to your point, well, not everyone's going to leave Australia. It's a lovely place. But more and more are certainly going to consider what's next. Now, of course, watch this space. There is a lot to unpack. There's a lot of scenarios. I mean, we could spend hours just diving into different CGT scenarios. Non-residents don't get the 50% discount anyway. So no big difference. But if there's a minimum 30% CGT, then how many losses do we actually want to accumulate if we can only get the rate down to 30%? So again, we need to think about that. If we are reinvesting dividends over time, then, I'm sure accountants are thinking, thank goodness for AI, because now they can go to the CPI tables on the ATO website and calculate the cost base over 25 years worth of dividends reinvested. I think there's a lot to unpack here, but definitely worth, speaking to your accountant, have a look at the strategy and map out the long-term with your advisor with the CGT side of things.
And one of the other big ones was obviously negative gearing. That's very topical with the property market, and again, I sort of understand why. Negative gearing grandfathered though to anyone that already has it. Is that going to help promote, I suppose, again, this future housing supply issue? They're limiting it to sort of new builds only. So do you think we'll see some changes coming into this in the sort of new year or in an election year, what the promises will look like?
Well, I feel like this is the one too that a lot of people have misconceptions around how it actually works, and it's such a the phrase negative gearing is such an attention attractor that people use it all the time. But to really break it down, right, gearing is borrowing to invest, and negative just means the cash flow is negative. Now, as it stands currently, if you make a loss on your property, you can use that loss to offset salary or dividends, capital gains, anything. The change they're proposing, negative gearing will still be a thing. However, you can only use property to offset property. So you will no longer be able to use it to offset, income or salary or any other thing. So it's still there. It's just not as beneficial. So for instance, you had a property that was positively geared and one that was negatively geared, they would still continue to offset each other as such. So I think a lot of people are really worried about this one. This is the big one people were really freaking out about. And look, I think the change is not as bad as it sounds. But again, this is the one that's been on the, the chopping board or the talking board for 20 years, 30 years. It's always a hot topic. So I think this is the one that, who knows, we may see some changes. The fact that new new builds can still continue to do this. It's just massively shifting people from existing dwellings to new builds. And again, that can be a terrible strategy for some people, because instead of going and buying something that they normally would have, that was a good investment, that was a good home, that was ticked all the boxes, they're now just pushing that out of their mind to go for something that's a brand new build just for this one reason. And, this one reason makes sense, but all the other 10 now don't. And they're not factoring in those. And it just means in 10 years' time, they might be left with a unit in Melbourne that's worth the same price that it was 10 years ago. But luckily, they've got, $5,000 of tax back a year. But they've missed out on $500,000 of growth. So again, I think this is the big one where people really need to review the circumstances and say, does this change impact the strategy overall? Or is it just something that, it's yes, a little bit of a disadvantage now, but we should still head down that same pathway?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack with this one. I mean, taking your point, new properties only, what is that going to result in? Prices of new builds are going to go up. Just as we saw with the first home buyer grant. We're going to throw out more money to first home buyers, and the price of everything under those thresholds all rose by about the same amount. Exactly the same when the government let everyone dip into their superannuation, house prices rose by the same amount. And it'll be no surprise we'll look back on this time and the same thing will have happened. But I think what's a little bit perhaps different this time is the cost of building has increased drastically. We're up about 50% since COVID. And I think what the budget missed and what, perhaps the government missed is you can't just incentivize demand and assume the supply will just magically appear. Because it's incredibly unprofitable for a lot of developers these days to actually make any money. So the things that do make money are huge high density dwellings, so towering apartment buildings, or high-end luxury apartments. So, a 4-story, 4-apartment or 8-apartment building in Bondi or Paddington or something selling for, $3 to $5 million each. Now, I'm not sure what that does for first-home buyers, because I don't imagine they're buying that. But again, that's really all that's profitable. So again, it doesn't really fix the supply issue, because it hasn't actually incentivized developers to build, those, I guess, things that first-home buyers can afford or want to live in, because they want to live near their family and probably don't want to buy an off-the-plan apartment in a 1,000-unit building in a city, Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane or anywhere. So I think that's going to be an interesting one to see play out. I think the other one, Will, to your point, you explained it beautifully. You can carry forward property losses to offset property gains one day, but only to 30%, right? If the CGT rule comes through. So then how much of a loss do we actually want to run that at to offset that eventual gain? So again, none of this is legislated, so take all of this with a pinch of salt. But I think it brings us back to, we're going to need to be updating modeling as individual investors, as advisors with clients, because maybe how much of a loss you run things at becomes a little bit different. Or maybe the way you own that asset becomes a little bit different. Own the property in a company and your company makes money elsewhere, you could offset the losses against the other revenue. Now, the average Australian just trying to buy their first investment property doesn't have a company and trusts and all this other stuff set up. So again, I think it, probably benefits the wrong people. Time will tell.
And I think too, like the Australian government, they're just making it more and more complex for your everyday people. Everyday people don't need something like boring can be profitable. And that's what your mums and dads and everyday people need. And they're just trying to, these Band-Aid fixes that keep going on top, on top, on top. And before you know it, the system's so complex that your everyday people who are saving a bit of money every single month and just trying to get ahead can't, because they look at the system and go, it's so complex. And then as financial advisors, the amount of work we have to do with accountants becomes so much more, and our fees as a business needs to increase from the resources we need to use. So that pushes more and more people out of getting the help that they need. Like it's not helping the everyday Australian. I feel like it puts things further out of reach for most people. And the whole purpose of this budget, as you said at the start, Jarrad, is to help workers, right? To incentivize people to, to do something, to make something of themselves and, put more of their money away and whatnot. But I just feel like it's it's very disincentivizing for the everyday person. Because like you said, there's people out there who make, 150 grand a year, and one's a stay-at-home parent, and they might have been using a trust structure, for their second property. Or it's not, this ultra wealthy that use these structures. There's everyday people who, they might be a plumber or a builder, and their company's owned in a trust structure, and their business revenue is 200 grand a year, and of that, they pay themselves 100 grand a year. And now they're just massively disincentivized by these new structures to actually put in a bit of hard work and save that little bit of extra money. Like, where's the incentivization now to save that extra $1,000 a month as opposed to spend it? That $1,000 a month doesn't go very far anymore. Might as well just spend it and enjoy yourself now. And hopefully your super's enough when you're 60. But as we know, a lot of business owners don't pay themselves super. So they're going to be stuffed. And then we're just going to be paying the age pension longer and longer and longer. So it just becomes this massive snowball effect where this disincentivization for people is more negative than positive, I would say.
This sort of brings back to my earlier point around obviously the pendulum swinging, right? And there's a couple of other MPs and senators, that are very popular on social media, that aren't sort of like the Teals, or they're obviously very much pro this simplification and, much broader tax reform. And, fingers crossed, a lot of sense will start to kick in. And, the pendulum swings, makes it easier, makes it simple for people to understand. Like, to an extent, I have really no problem in, sort of separating investment income versus wage income. So it just comes down to, is it going to be fit for purpose for the broader Australian and the average Australian? Because, if we look at the statistics, the average Australian is only earning, or the average household income is only somewhere between 100 and 170,000 Australian dollars a year as the average nuclear family. So, there's still a broader tall poppy issue that needs to be cut through. Because it would be aspirational to say that Australians should be able to be wealthy people. They should be able to get ahead. They should be able to do this, and the government should be able to support them to do that.
Absolutely. And to be able to understand it without needing to pay people like us.
Yeah.
Not to talk ourselves out of business, but, if it becomes so out of reach, to your point, Will, and so expensive, then, what are we doing for the average Australian? I think the other interesting change, which, again, is whether it pushes people in the right or the wrong direction, is the removal of negative gearing has also changed borrowing capacity. So whenever, and particularly for Australian residents, not so much for expats, because as non-residents, you typically can't factor in the negative gearing anyway. So it won't have had much of an impact for your borrowing. And similarly, if you're buying commercial property. But if you're an Australian resident, what happened basically, and bear in mind, none of this is legislation yet, but the banks have largely all changed policy already. Macquarie was first, I believe. And what it meant was that when you go and apply for a loan, and see, we're talking about investment properties here, and let's say you want to borrow $700,000, and that property is going to be negatively geared in that you can claim the interest, you can factor in that into your net income. So your borrowing capacity was higher. Now, to give you an idea, we had a client recently who had applied, their pre-approval had expired, and they had to go and get a new one. Their borrowing capacity dropped from $1 million, just shy of, by 300,000. Now that is massive. That is the difference between, a sort of class A suburb, something that's quite blue chip, to something that's potentially quite different, or a different dwelling, of course. Now, with some lenders, different policies, but obviously policies change. Banks tend to behave a little bit like sheep. One changes policy, they all pretty quickly follow, especially the majors. But what you can do is advise the bank or your broker that you are buying new, and therefore the negative gearing can continue. So does this push us into the right thing or the wrong thing? Now, it's not to say new is bad. There's some cracking new properties out there in the right suburbs, the right style dwelling. But again, if you're investing in a studio apartment in a massive building in the wrong location, does that get us to the right outcome? And, banks are quite conservative in terms of the rules they tend to adopt. Valuations are no doubt going to get a bit softer. Rents might get a bit softer depending on what happens. But yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting to see how borrowing actually plays out over the next 12 months.
And back on obviously structures and changes to this that we saw as well was trusts. So a lot of people use trusts to buy those properties and or to hold the shares of your small business or company just from an asset protection perspective. And historically, trusts have been this sort of very helpful tax vehicle where you could have sole earner distributing income through a trust, and then obviously can distribute through the family unit. Many years ago, obviously they removed the incentive for trust distributions to children, and then suddenly they got taxed very heavily. But you could still obviously the adults and making sure that they were receiving or beneficiaries of that trust. You could easily distribute there. Now, they're also bringing in a 30% minimum tax on all trust distributions. So this is definitely changes that positioning, changes that story around what is the purpose of a trust. And one of the things that they obviously pointed out was this applies on discretionary trusts. So the government says, right, where you have discretion to distribute this income, then this minimum tax is going to be applied. So other trust structures, like fixed unit trusts, they will be largely unaffected. But I suppose the broader one as well is, what is the impact on testamentary trusts? Deceased estate Australia does not have inheritance tax. But is this, to an extent, you start using discretionary trusts as part of, broader estate planning in the longer term? Are they now subject to this new tax? Is this just, potentially even read, inheritance tax in disguise? The view on this, I think, needs to be worked on a little bit more, just to see, this play out in practice. Because yes, wealthy people do use trusts, but a lot of small businesses and a lot of regular Australians use them.
Look, I think is the two, like, trusts cost time, they cost money, and they cost effort to set up, and they cost time, money, and effort to manage. I think a lot of people now are starting that those three things are becoming too much for the potential benefit that they may get. You might get a $10,000 benefit by using a trust, but it costs you a few $1,000s to set up and a few $1,000s each year to manage with all the accounting and whatnot. And that benefit and time and output now is becoming much more diminished. Now, don't get me wrong, trusts can still be phenomenal structures for, helping protect assets, for protecting your family, your kids, future investments. But again, it's back to my earlier point. I feel like they're just making things more and more difficult for everyday people. Because the people who use these structures, who have tens of millions and hundreds of millions, like, they're going to find other ways to invest that money and be fine. It's the people that will be impacted by this, I feel, will be your everyday people who are just trying to get ahead. And, they're working hard, they're doing long days, they're not taking that extra holiday, they're not buying that Mercedes, they're saving up, they're trying to put their kids in a good school and, get ahead. And now these everyday people are just, the benefit for them is being diminished, every second.
100%. Yeah, I think it's probably worth, just highlighting for people who may not already be aware. I think our industry especially talks a lot about trusts, discretionary trusts, fixed trusts, unit trusts. Probably just worth noting that currently, under the current framework, the trust itself doesn't pay tax. So effectively that passes through to the beneficiary. So if Will receives income from a trust that might have been earned through a property or a business or some shares, that trust must distribute all income each year, and will pay tax at his marginal tax rate. What the proposed change is that minimum tax rate the trust would pay would be 30%. That tax credit potentially flows through to Will as an individual, but not to a bucket company, which is where the bucket company strategy could potentially be dead in the water or would need to change, because the trust would pay 30% tax and then the company would pay another 25 or 30, depending on how it was structured, which is effectively double tax, but may very well go through as sort of intended. Now, Joel, you touched on a really, I think, if everybody listening takes away nothing else from this podcast, a really important point with testamentary trusts. We talk, as I'm sure you guys do with Australians, to go and speak to their solicitor, get their estate planning sorted, talk to them about testamentary trusts, whether they need them, and the majority are discretionary trusts. So assets go into that testamentary trust. The reason they are so popular and such effective tax planning, estate planning tools is because they can distribute income to minors, and those minors get taxed at adult rates, which means the first 18,000 is tax-free. So that's an incredible tool. Now, one of the most important things, obviously we have until 1 July 28, this is proposed to come in. Personally, I think the government's given themselves as much time as possible because there's going to be huge pushback on this. And this is where a significant portion of their modeled revenue comes from. But what I think is really important with this is if you have, particularly with a lot of our expat clients, older parents who may be sorting out their estate planning, maybe they've elected to have a testamentary trust. If they don't have a power of attorney, as in somebody nominated to make decisions for them, and they need to go and change the structure of that trust because the rules change, they may not be able to do so. So get in place these powers of attorney, whoever it may be, start talking to your parents about it, or your grandparents or your uncle or your auntie or whoever it is. Get these nominations in place, because if the rules go through as intended, there's probably going to be a lot of people who are looking to convert trusts into fixed trusts, where they will still receive those same tax benefits, not as a discretionary trust. But of course, if your older parents or grandparents are not of sound mind, they may not be able to make those changes. So please, if nothing else, let this be a reminder to get your estate planning sorted, because it's just so important.
Absolutely. And I think just estate planning in general, it's generally a morbid conversation to have amongst family. But, this ultimately could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars later on if that stone is left unturned.
It's something people don't think about. I was speaking with a potential prospect just the other day whose father unfortunately has lost capacity and has all these assets in the US. They have no idea where they are, who they're with, what logins are. Don't know if he's got shares, don't know if he's got a 401k, IRA, have absolutely no idea. And so the conversation was, how do we find these? Your guess is as good as mine. We just need to try and find them, call up the IRS, go through old tax accountants. The father at lost capacity doesn't know who his accountant was anymore. So, having these things, like having a record of these things, having power of attorney in place, doing all of these things well and truly in advance, it's very, very important, because the headache it gives you, if they're not in place, trying to sort things out, can take years. It's just an absolute nightmare to see.
And I suppose the last one that was changing is, complete nearly lack of change, is superannuation. Superannuation still being, I would say the one of the most tax effective and optimal structures in Australia still. We see a lot of people think of superannuation as, I'm with this fund, or I'm with this industry fund, or SMSF. Ultimately, superannuation is a tax structure in its sort of small isolation. What you do with that structure and how you put money in. Obviously, there's rules around those certain elements, but largely superannuation remained unchanged. We did see, obviously, Division 296 passed. So that is an additional tax on earnings above 3 million and 10 million, retrospectively up to 40%. So the government is sort of chewing down on this idea that superannuation is for the benefit of retirement, So how much money should you have in super to benefit your retirement? Well, apparently it's not more than $3 million and definitely not more than 10. So that's historically been potentially a tax, avoiding issue there. So yeah, we'll see the caps index as well from next year. So that could be, again, additional opportunities just as a planning piece. Just, if these changes are going to impact you, do you restructure your sort of those financial affairs? Do you have trust that, for now, these assets might be more tax effective somewhere else? Superannuation can still be one of those areas that can be for consideration.
Yeah, most certainly. I think there's a lot to unpack on super, and no doubt it's going to be a good opportunity. I think it's very clear that the current leadership wants more and more in industry super. And I think that was probably made clear in some of the discussion around the performance test being changed to more about what do they contribute to the environment and sustainability and housing. And, does that just become a bit farcical of, well, you don't need to actually generate returns for members anymore. You just need to actually, chuck $100 million into some sort of sustainable project. So I think if nothing else, that's going to be a good call to action for people to look at how their super's invested. Is it aligned with how they want it to be invested, or whatever their goals may be, whether that's self-managed or industry or retail. To your point, Joel, such an important structure moving forward. Excellent. Well, look, I think that kind of brings us to the main areas outlined in the budget. Obviously, we will be watching this space very closely. We've got the Senate discussion next week, and I believe the schedule for the sort of formal feedback is the 22nd of June. The government wants this all rushed through by the 2nd of July, so they can all have a nice winter holiday as they break. So watch this space closely, book in a call with your advisor. Don't rush off the back of this, as we've said multiple times, and make any crazy quick decisions or changes. I don't think that's going to benefit anyone. But yes, seek advice, run the models, crunch the numbers, and yeah, please do spend the time researching how these changes may or may not impact your plans.
Most definitely. Now, guys, as always, we do release the podcast on the last Wednesday of every single month. We interview an expert every single month. Now, we were the experts today. We do like quite experts in our field. So all senior financial advisors, I think we can give ourselves that title. But look, we love hearing from our listeners as well. So if you do ever want us to focus on a certain topic or interview a certain person, whether it be property, moving overseas, aged care, budgeting, you name it, we can do it. We'd love to hear from our listeners. So definitely, send us a message. And you'll be able to find the podcast, as always, on all major hosting services. So whether you get your podcasts through Spotify or Apple or YouTube, you'll be able to find us there.
And we're also on the social media feeds as well. So we're at MoneySideUp on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, or X, as known today. Next month, we have a great speaker lined up who will be exploring foreign exchange strategies for Australians living around the globe. Thank you so much for tuning in. And as always, we look forward to seeing you in the next episode.
Until next time.
Thanks, everyone.